Welcome, everyone. I'm Gina Reganini, Director of Educational Initiatives at Northeastern Alumni Relations. And I would like to welcome you all to our final lecture of the fall semester for NU at Noon. And it's a good one. I have to say, when our speaker and I, Seth Harris, when he and I connected, it was over the summer, I believe. I think it was August. And I didn't tell him this, but when we decided what the topic would be with unions and strikes and all of that, I mean, you probably all remember, there was a lot going on. And I thought to myself, well, we're talking mid-November. Is this going to be an old stale topic by then? Will people have interest? And as you know, it's just, the hits keep on coming. So we're so excited to have Seth here. Seth Harris is a distinguished professor of practice at Northeastern University and affiliated faculty and a senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change and its partner project, the GovLab, where he runs the Initiative on Labor and Economic Justice. Prior to joining Northeastern, Professor Harris was the Deputy Assistant to the President for Labor and the Economy and Deputy Director of the Biden White House's National Economic Council. He served as the Acting Secretary of Labor and Deputy Secretary of Labor in the Obama-Biden administration. And we're so glad to welcome you today. Take the stage, Seth.
Thanks. I'm so delighted to be here with you. Thank you very much for welcoming me. I've spent the last couple of days over at Northeastern. I actually live just outside Washington, D.C., but I come up to Boston often for Northeastern events, and I sometimes teach up here, and so really a privilege to be with you. Thanks, Gina and the Alumni Relations team for welcoming me and for inviting me, and really a pleasure. So I expect to learn a lot from you during this discussion. I already know what I think, so I really want to hear what you think. I want to hear your questions, comments, just reactions. This is, I think, a really important and interesting topic. So let me start by sort of getting a sense of who we have in the audience, and that includes you, Facebook Live audience. I'm looking at you, and I hope I'm making eye contact with the camera, but including the folks in the room. So let's start with this. Raise your hand if you're able, if you are a Northeastern alum. All right. And Northeastern alum family members, or partners, or friends. There we go. Raise your hand if you have ever been or currently are a union member. Oh, I got him. My audience is here. That's beautiful. Raise your hand if you have a family member, some sort of close family, parent, child, sibling, partner, spouse, who is a union member or was a union member at any point. All right, so I've got almost everybody in the room has some connection to a union in some way. Okay, now here's the big question, because it gets right to our topic for today. Raise your hand if you have seen a news story or otherwise heard about a strike over, let's say, the last 6 months, a union strike. Okay? No, haven't heard about any strikes of any kind over the last 6 months? No news. Wow. Okay, so then this talk is going to be really boring for you. I want to be honest, because it's all about what's been happening lately. Okay, and let me just ask, what strikes just that pop into your head that you have heard about, the folks who raised their hands? What strike?
The writers' strike, the film writers' strike.
The Writers Guild strike out in California. I think of it as one of the Hollywood strikes. Who else? Auto workers, absolutely. The teacher strike in Andover, right. There's also a teacher strike going on in Portland, Oregon. That's another one. Teacher strike in Andover. Any others that you've? The actors strike, the SAG-AFTRA strike. We'll talk about that a little bit. Starbucks yesterday. Yeah, even that one? You didn't hear? You don't drink coffee either? No coffee, no news? No. Can I just say? I'm with you. This is one of the biggest conflicts in my marriage, can I just say? My wife is a Starbucks person. I'm like, no. Okay, so I have been spending a lot of time over the last several months thinking about why it is the United States is experiencing so many strikes. And let me just say, this is not just a media phenomenon, it's just that you happened to hear about it. We're actually seeing a strike wave in the United States. I don't think you can describe it any other way. And because I am an academic, I always have to bring data to validate the points that I make. So let me offer some data to support that conclusion. So unions in the United States in 2022, which is the latest data we have, represented only 10.1% of the U.S. workforce. That, by the way, that number is called union density. In my world, they call that union density. The percentage of the workforce that's represented by unions or as union members is called union density. 10.1% is the lowest union density rate since before Congress passed the National Labor Relations Act in 1935. We're down at a bottom level right now for union density in the United States. But strike activity in 2023 has reached a level that we have not seen since the turn of the 21st century, when union density was a third higher than it is now. So we're seeing more strikes, but lower union density in 2023. According to my friends at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, employers lost 11 million labor hours to strikes in 2023 through September. That's the largest loss of time to strikes in 23 years. In each of the last 4 months, there's been a loss of more than 2 million days of work lost to strikes. In November, 4.5 million days of labor were lost to strike. The way you count days of labor is you take the number of workers, you multiply it by the number of days they're out on strike. So if 100 workers are out on strike for a week, that's 70 days. Just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, 4.5 million days in 1 month of November. We haven't seen anything like that in a generation. And no other month, even recently, comes close. The next highest month is like 2.5 million. And over the last 4 months, as I said, 2 million days of work lost each month for the last 4 months. Now, my alma mater is a school called the School of Industrial and Labor Relations at Cornell University. And they have something called the Cornell ILR Labor Action Tracker. They're not very good at branding things at my alma mater. It's a big mouthful. So the Cornell ILR Labor Action Tracker. And basically what they do is something that the Bureau of Labor Statistics hasn't done since the 1970s. They track every strike and every walkout and every collective action by workers, not just by unions, but by workers everywhere in the country. It's unbelievably valuable. They've only been doing it for a couple of years. But according to the Cornell ILR Labor Action Tracker, the number of strikes beginning each month has increased through September 2023. And in addition, the total number of strikes underway, not just starting but underway, has increased through September of 2023. And most important, the number of workers who are striking increased markedly, as I said, this summer. That was because that was when the SAG-AFTRA strike, which involved 65,000 workers out in Hollywood, began. And it grew again in September and October. That's when the UAW strike against the big three automakers and the strike by a coalition of unions against Kaiser Permanente and the strike by the unions, the coalition of unions, a different coalition of unions against the Detroit casino hotels began. And there were several other strikes. We talked about Andover, and I mentioned Portland. That was a pretty big strike as well. I've seen one report from the Cornell ILR Labor Action Tracker suggesting that more than 330,000 American workers were engaged in strikes since the start of September. It's November, since the start of September. And more than 468,000 workers have struck since the beginning of the year. Those numbers dwarf the activity that went on in 2021 and 2022, and really every year since the turn of the century. And we just barely avoided other strikes. The Teamsters at UPS, the Unite Here culinary workers and bartenders in the Las Vegas casinos, that you may have heard about. And let me also say, the SAG-AFTRA members who work in the video gaming industry have voted to authorize a strike, and they may strike. So, and let me also say, in addition to all of that, those are sort of what I think of as the sexy headline strikes, the unions you've heard of, the big unions, right? The Hollywood goes on strike, and of course television covers it because it's a television story, right? You can get, you know, Clooney on television, and it's very exciting for people, right? Or you get, I'm blanking on his name, Adam Conover, right, who's very telegenic and is hilarious. He's a stand-up comedian. He goes on, and he's very entertaining, talking about the SAG-AFTRA. Well, there are thousands of other workers who work in, you know, like machine plants, or work in, you know, doing auto mechanic work, or who are also getting ready to strike all across the United States. Okay, so lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of strikes in this strike wave in America right now. Why? Why? That's the question that I wanted to help you to try to understand. I'll give you my hypothesis. I have two pieces to it, two parts to it. No doubt, workers are a very big part of the reason for this increased strike activity. Workers are, let me just say, sick and tired of being on the short end of economic inequality that has grown to what you'd have to describe as Gilded Age levels, right? Anybody watch that television show? I think it's on HBO, Gilded Age, right? It shows the fantastically wealthy people who, some of the biggest, fanciest families in New York City around the turn of the century, the turn of the last century, right? And all this unbelievable opulence. That's where we are now. That's where people feel we are now, and they're right. In fact, the people who have lots and lots of money now have infinitely more money than the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Beaumonts, those big fancy families from that time in our history. Workers have watched as employers have derived massive profits from their labor and turned those profits into epic returns for shareholders and massive salaries for executives, while workers have been left to struggle with flat or declining real wages, meaning inflation-adjusted wages, for decades. For decades. In fact, this was a major theme of the UAW strike, for those who paid close attention to it. The UAW said, essentially, you know, when they asked them, what wage increase do you want? They said, we want the same thing the CEOs got, 40%. It was shocking to people who don't work in the auto industry that CEOs got a 40% pay increase. That money came from the workers. That money was created by the workers. Workers also lived through, as we all did, a pandemic, during which many employers showed a much greater concern for revenues and costs in their own survival than their workers' lives and safety. And then after the pandemic, where workers really felt that they didn't get their due and were put at risk, put their lives at risk in some cases, to serve coffee at Starbucks, right, or to deliver packages at Amazon, or to give other, I could give a lot of other examples. Then, after the pandemic sort of calmed down, it's not really gone, but the pandemic calmed down, then what did employers do? Come back to the office now. Why do we have to come back to the office? No reason, we want you back in the office. It was like rubbing salt in an open wound. Workers really got angry about that as well. Workers also understand that they have more individual and collective power in this economy than they've had in a very long time. The unemployment rate in the United States has been at or below 4% for 22 consecutive months. 22 consecutive months. Now, remember the last time there was lots and lots of strike activity? I keep talking about the turn of the century. By the way, my kids, who were born around the turn of the century, get a huge kick out of that phrase, because that's a phrase they think of as being like the turn from 1899 to 1900, not 1999 to 2000. But it was the turn of the century when we last saw a lot of strikes. That period, unemployment was at 4.1%, slightly higher, for 15 months. Remember I told you 4% now for 22 months, 4.1% for 15 months. You have to go back to the late 1960s when I was just a kid. I know I look youthful, don't be fooled, I'm an old man, right? But when I was just a kid was the last time we had this kind of duration of extremely low unemployment. So now we have millions more job openings than unemployed workers. Layoffs are at a historically very low level and have been for a very, very, very long time. That's a number that I watch every week. And job growth, frankly, has slowed a little bit, but finding workers still requires employers to invest huge resources. They have to work really, really, really hard to find the workers that they need. And as a result of that, non-union workers can quit their jobs because there's another job out there for them. In fact, if you quit your job and get a new job, you're going to get a bigger pay increase than if you stay in your job and your employer gives you an increase. It's 8% versus 4.5%, depending upon the industry. All right? So, in fact, the way that individual workers who don't have unions bargain is they go look for another job. We had an 18-month period over the last 3 years, 18 months consecutively, where 4 million workers quit their jobs every single month, overwhelmingly quitting low-wage, low-quality jobs to go to higher-wage, higher-quality jobs. It was great for workers. That's real power. But if you're a union member, you don't have to quit, right? You can stay and fight. You can strike, and you can demand better pay, benefits, and working conditions in your current job. But there's not really a meaningful risk, and I'm going to come back to this in just a little bit, for most workers, that you will be replaced, right? That's the risk when you strike, is that your employer will say, bye-bye, and bring somebody in behind you to do your job. That's what makes striking risky. There are other risks associated with it. You're basically battling with your employer, and workers are very dependent on their employers for lots of things like a paycheck, health insurance, other things. But now, if somehow an employer were able to replace a worker, there's plenty of jobs out there for those workers. Now, they don't want to change. Workers don't want to be disrupted. They don't want to change their lives unless they choose to improve their lot. They don't want to be forced out, right? But if they do get forced out, it's like, there's 17 Starbucks in our town of 1,000 people. I'll go down the street, right? That's all I have to do. So that also is power. And let me add, and there's a little bit of advertisement for my former boss, all of this is right at the heart of the Biden-Harris economic agenda. This didn't just happen. This was the plan. The plan was to put power in workers' hands by putting money in their pockets. Let me say, a lot of the appointments that the president made also were about worker power. His appointments to an organization called the National Labor Relations Board, which oversees private sector relations. You have a much more pro-worker group of folks who are leading that agency now. But building an economy with abundant jobs and rising wages that puts power in workers' hands, that's exactly what all of these bills that you've heard about passing through Congress were designed to do. The American Rescue Plan put hundreds of billions of dollars in workers' pockets through things like the child tax credit, which particularly helped low-wage workers. The bipartisan infrastructure law, you've all heard about that, $1.3 trillion in infrastructure spending. The Chips and Sciences Act, which is all about building a domestic semiconductor industry. So there's manufacturing facilities going into Syracuse, New York, for example, not far from where I went to college, a town that was devastated by deindustrialization. It's going to be completely reborn because of this huge semiconductor manufacturing facility that's going to be built there. And it's not the only community, it's one of several dozen that will have that. The Inflation Reduction Act, the largest ever investment in climate, right? Fighting against climate change. Lots and lots and lots and lots of jobs. The president likes to say, when I hear climate change, I think of jobs. When I hear about the green economy, I think of jobs. And that really is what the Inflation Reduction Act is going to produce. And finally, workers have power because the political and social context around unions has changed. Now, I helped to run a blog, an online website, called the Power at Work blog. And if you're inclined, you can find it at poweratwork.us, because we're very deeply patriotic people at the Burns Center for Social Change. So poweratwork.us. So I run a blog, and we do written stuff, but we also do video and audio interviews with folks. And I interview union leaders. I've interviewed the president of the AFL-CIO, who's an old friend of mine, and the president of the Teachers Union, who's an old friend of mine. But we also interview frontline workers, and often very young workers. And so they come on, these young workers come on, and they say, you know what? Being in a union now is cool. Now I'm way too old to know what really is cool. I mean, I'm about as uncool as you can be. I'm middle-aged dad. I'm about as uncool as they come. But when they say it, these 20-somethings, these 30-somethings, that really tells you something. Let me also say, for evidence that young people think that, one of the places where young people are organizing most is on college campuses, including our college campus. The graduate workers at Northeastern just had a union election. They barely squeaked by with 94% of the vote. My alma mater, the graduate workers there, literally last week had an election. They beat Northeastern at 96% of the vote. The union won with 96%. That's like Saddam Hussein election numbers, right? I mean, that's unbelievable outcomes in those two. And let me say, that's happening in campuses north, south, west, southwest, midwest, doesn't matter. Young people are joining unions in droves now because it's cool, partly because it's cool to be in a union. Unions now have a 67% favorable rating among the American people as a whole, and even more favorable rating among people, workers under the age of 30. It's 88% favorable there, and 65% of workers under the age of 30 say that they would like to have a union in their workplace right now. And let me say, of course, that's the sort of the cultural context. The political context, President Biden very proudly tells everybody, repeatedly, like I got a little tired of hearing it when I was working for him, he's the most pro-union president in American history. He says that about himself, very proudly so, and he very famously, you may have seen this if you were, some of us may have seen, not everybody would have seen this, but those who watch television news or saw it in a newspaper, on a news website, President Biden went to the UAW picket line, spoke to the workers. He actually put his arm around a striker and said a version of, I'm paraphrasing him because I try to be careful never to quote him, but to paraphrase him, he said, you're right to be demanding what you're demanding. He endorsed their demands, not just for her, but for all the UAW workers and workers generally. You should be asking for more, he basically said to all workers. Now, are workers more likely to strike because their president is standing behind them? I would say they're not less likely to strike because their president is standing behind them, right? I'm not giving him credit. I'm just saying the context in which workers are operating, very different now than, say, it was under President Reagan or under President Trump. Okay, so that's the worker part of the story. What's the other part of the story? And let me just give you a quick digression. In between my service I've served in 3 presidential administrations: Clinton administration, Obama administration, Biden administration. In between I go into exile. Or, you know, my wife says you crawl into your shell and then you poke your head out every 2 years or so just to see what's happening. In between my service in the Obama administration and my service in the Biden administration, I was a teacher and a lawyer and a business advisor. And part of my law practice, people don't believe this, but I promise it's true. Part of my practice was that organizations would hire me to speak to their board of directors or their senior human resources team or to some other internal group, some senior internal group. And my job was to say the things that they all knew were true but couldn't say out loud. So the idea was if I said it, it would break the ice and then they could all talk about it and solve the problems that they all knew were there. And let me say, they never invited me back, but it was really a very interesting insight. So just a couple of weeks ago, 2-3 weeks ago, I spoke to a room full, like a hotel ballroom full of senior human resources officials from Fortune 500 companies. There are about 200 people, 150, 200 people in the room, like all the brand name companies that you've heard of and a bunch you've never heard of but that are gigantic. They're vice presidents for labor relations, senior vice presidents for human resources were in the room. And I said to them, I am going to do for you what I did for those clients who never invited me back. Ironically, that group did invite me back. They want me to come back and next time they meet. But I'm going to tell you a bunch of things that you know are true, but that you wouldn't say out loud because it's not seen as being appropriate. And as I was talking to them, people were like half nodding. They couldn't openly like, yeah, that guy's right, yeah. They couldn't do that because of the room that they were in. But they could sort of nod their heads a little bit, and a lot of heads were nodding at what I'm about to tell you. They knew, I know, and you know intuitively, even if you're not in this field, but this is, you know this. It takes two to strike. It takes two to strike. You need workers, a union, and you need an employer. Right? Let me say, you don't even have to be in this field. You just have to be married or have ever had a romantic relationship or a parent or a child, right? In those relationships, it's just, fights don't just happen because of one person. There's something going on in the relationship. Same thing in collective bargaining. Of course, there are communications failures, right? Again, if you've had a romantic partner, you know what a communication failure looks like, right? We all have them eventually. And in collective bargaining, in addition to that, there's sometimes bad math, right? We think the wages go up $10 an hour and that's $1 million. You think it's $2 million. There's bad facts, right? This is unsafe. No, it's not unsafe. We had a guy come in and look at it. No, you didn't. We had a guy come in and look at it, right? That kind of bad facts. And let me say, every human being, these are human beings sitting down at a table in a sort of a tense, I've been at collective bargaining tables, it's sort of a tense environment. And every human being experiences anger, frustration, confusion, hubris, sometimes cluelessness, right? I like to think I'm a living embodiment of that human characteristic. All of those things can screw up collective bargaining relationships, but usually in mature bargaining relationships, meaning relationships that have been going on for a long time, usually it's the substance of the bargaining positions that causes the strike, right? Usually in a mature relationship, you kind of know how to talk to one another. Even if you're not very good at it, you know how to have a conversation. In collective bargaining, it's the same thing. I think the current strike wave has been caused in part by employers whose behavior and decisions are just wholly inconsistent with the facts that I just gave you. The current economic reality, the state of worker activism and worker attitudes, and the volume of worker power that defines labor relations in 2023. And I would say that there are two models. The first model was illustrated by the Teamsters UPS bargaining relationship. Now, I watch this a lot more closely than you do because it's what I do. And my observation, and I'm an outsider, I was not in the bargaining room, I was in the negotiating room, I wasn't, I did talk to both sides, but I didn't talk in great detail, and I wouldn't disclose what they told me, of course. But from an outsider's perspective, UPS's leadership may not have begun the negotiations with the requisite understanding, but eventually, and I think fairly quickly, they came to understand their situation and the state of their relationships with their employees, and this is what it was. Teamsters drivers were really angry, really angry. Let me also say I have a couple of cousins who work for UPS, one of whom was a driver, another whom was a sort of middle-level management. So I got a little insight from them about this too. The drivers were really mad. The company had earned immense profits, particularly during the pandemic. Why? Because we were all stuck in our houses ordering stuff, right? You all experienced that. I experienced that. The company earned immense profits from that, and drivers' wages had not risen commensurately. Employees, frankly, felt insulted and divided and cheated by a two-tier employment system. The longer-term employees got better wages, better benefits, better everything. The newer employees did much worse. And, in the labor movement, the one defining characteristic of unions is solidarity. One for all for one. That's solidarity. Well, if you divide us into two parts, there's going to be jealousies, there's going to be anger. It splits the membership, and that's what happened to the Teamsters, and people were really upset about it. Let me just say the long-term members were upset about it, and the newer members were upset about it. They didn't like it. Heat hazards in UPS's ubiquitous brown trucks that you all see driving through your neighborhoods were really posing serious and rising health risks. Not so much in Massachusetts, but imagine driving around in an unair-conditioned brown truck in South Texas or South Florida or the Arizona desert. I spent a year out in the Arizona desert. I'd never experienced anything like that. And then you drive it around, and then you have to get in the back, which is sealed. Imagine what the temperatures are like there. One of their drivers died because of a heat stroke. Work that could have been performed by the UPS's Teamsters was being outsourced. Perhaps most important, the Teamsters had new leadership, a Bostonian by the name of Sean O'Brien, who demanded solutions and made absolutely clear that a strike was inevitable if mutually agreeable solutions were not found. And let me also say, I think we can all agree that replacing 330,000 drivers, that's how many drivers UPS had who were Teamsters members, replacing all of those folks if they went out on strike like quickly, out of the question. Never going to happen. I would also add that the Teamsters ran a very sophisticated and relentless public advocacy strategy that built public and political support for the workers' contract demands. And I offer as an example that the Teamsters, who are not affiliated with the AFL-CIO, got immense support from the AFL-CIO, advocating on their behalf to the public. So understanding all of those circumstances, UPS surveyed the surroundings and said, we get it, and they negotiated a contract that they could afford and that met the employees' concerns. So wages went way up. The two-tier system disappeared. Air conditioning is going to be added to the delivery trucks, and in the interim they're going to have a lot of fans added in so that you have air circulation. It's safer. And jobs are going to be insourced, so what is now the largest private sector collective bargaining unit in the country is going to get even bigger. There are going to be more Teamsters at UPS. UPS, I think, accurately assessed the situation. Don't take my word for it. When the union asked their members, are you for it or against it? 83% voted for it. 83% voted to ratify that agreement. They got it. They got it right. Okay, so that's the first model. The second model is the Hollywood studios. So from the beginning of their negotiations, the studio leadership and their trade association, which is called the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, AMPTP they go by, they made clear that their priorities were to cut costs and jobs, including by using artificial intelligence for script writing and script supplementation, and to structure more writing jobs as contingent work arrangements, meaning you don't have a job all day, every day for 5 days a week, and then you come back the next week and your job is still there. It means we'll hire you for 4 hours this day, 8 hours that day, 2 days next week, and we'll let you know after that. That's one kind of contingent work arrangement. The studios seemingly believed that they could achieve those goals by delaying negotiations for months and inflicting as much pain as possible on the Writers Guild of America members to force concessions. One studio executive said the quiet part out loud to a trade publication called Deadline. Here's what that studio executive said. The end game is to allow things to drag on until union members start losing their apartments and losing their houses. I said to the senior HR people, the senior labor relations people in the meeting, I said, I'm not your lawyer, but don't say that. Don't, you can think it, don't say that out loud. Disney CEO Bob Iger derided the writers and actors bargaining position as, and I'm quoting now, not realistic, and adding to the challenges that this business is already facing. In other words, the studio's expectation was that writers and actors would subsidize the studio's competition with one another, and they're in immense competition. Let me just say, there's way too many streaming services, there's way too much content, and they're losing money because of it. That was a bad business choice by the companies, not by the writers and actors. But the expectation was that the actors and the writers would take pay cuts, give up jobs in order to subsidize that competition through the bargaining process. right? And also, pay and staffing and job displacing technology, all of that would be a way to pay for this competition. Now, in fairness to them, that has been the default strategy among private sector employers in many industries for decades in the United States. Employers have had the power to force workers to subsidize them as businesses have tried to navigate how to maximize profits in a world where the economy is much more globalized, labor markets are much more globalized, and we have tectonic technological changes, right? Just since I graduated college, we've had the internet, right? Now we have AI. Those are gigantic changes that are different from what we've seen in the past. Unions have been forced in the past into concessions bargaining, giving things back, not getting things for their members. And they did it in order to save jobs and to prevent offshoring and other forms of outsourcing of jobs and to ward off technology displacing their members. And often that just didn't work. It didn't work. Jobs were lost. Employers fissured employment relationships, meaning what used to be, I work for you, you're my boss, I'm your employee. Now you work for a subcontractor who has you on part-time and a temporary arrangement, and they sell your services to the original employer whom you used to work for, right? That's what a fissured relationship looks like. One kind of fissured relationship works like. Newer unionized workers in some places, I just told you about UPS, it was also true at the big three automakers, were forced to surrender wages, retirement security, and quality health insurance that longer tenured workers bargained for in earlier years. And let me also say, some unions were just busted. Some employers were able to just outright bust their unions, meaning get rid of their unions. The result of all this for the studios was a writers' strike that ended just a few days shy of being the longest writers' strike in the history of that union. Right? It was over 140 days. The longest strike was 156 days. The Writers Guild did not get everything it wanted at the bargaining table, but it got most of what its members demanded and needed, including job protections, limits on technology, and robust residuals from streaming. That's one of the ways that actors and writers get paid, is when stuff is put on a streaming service, they are now going to get some money, what's called on the back end, right, every time it's shown. How do I know that the Writers Guild members thought that they got what they needed and wanted? Remember I told you the Teamsters, 83% in favor of ratification? Anybody want to guess? Writers Guild? 99% in favor of ratification. They won. The Writers Guild just outright won the strike. And let me say that strike cost the studios billions. They've now settled with SAG-AFTRA. It took an additional month to settle with the actors in SAG-AFTRA, right? And so it cost them additional billions, and they're still having trouble ramping up. They're still having trouble ramping up production. One very important point before I close, and take your questions, and I really, really want to hear what you have to say. Not every group of workers and not every union is in the same position as the Teamsters and the Writers Guild and SAG-AFTRA and the UAW and the Coalition of Kaiser Permanente unions. There are two critical characteristics of those unions and others like them. One, some of them represent workers in occupations that have high barriers to entry to the occupation, right? It could be skills. It could be a credential. It could be a license. It could be work experience. It could be just that you have to have certain knowledge, even if it's not credentialized in some way. You can't just show up and write a television script. You can't just show up and perform physical therapy or conduct an X-ray, right? You can't walk onto a campus and become a graduate worker at Northeastern or Cornell or any other institution. Other unions in this category, so that's one, that's the first thing. So there's a barrier to entry. It's often skills, but also credentials and other things. Second, some unions in this category, and this definitely includes the Teamsters, and I would say it probably includes the UAW as well, they just represent so many workers. They have so much density in an industry or with a particular employer that replacing them is just out of the question. You could not conceivably replace all of those workers and get the work done that you need to get done. As I said, where are you going to find 330,000 truck drivers? Where are you going to find 150,000 auto workers? But then there's another category of unions and workers, those representing workers in occupations with low barriers to entry and insufficient numbers. I think we have to acknowledge that that's one very important reason why, even though Workers United, which is affiliated with a union called the Service Employees Union, represents 350 Starbucks with 9,000 employees, they cannot get Starbucks to negotiate a contract with them. Even the National Labor Relations Board, which regulates in this space, has said Starbucks is breaking the law. They're obligated by law to bargain in good faith. The NLRB has said in more than 100 circumstances, the Starbucks has violated the law. The union cannot force them to the bargaining table for a couple of reasons. One is, although I love baristas and really admire the work they do and have benefited immensely from the work of baristas, not a very big barrier to entry to be a barista, right? And the second thing is they only represent 350 stores. Starbucks has 9,000 stores, and that's only part of their business, right? They sell stuff in supermarkets. They sell, there was Starbucks coffee, feh, in my hotel room. That's Yiddish for I'm not drinking that. Right, so think also about the warehouse workers who organized in Staten Island, not far from where I grew up, in New York at JFK 8, the warehouse in Staten Island. Right? Warehouse workers, critically important. None of us would have gotten any of the stuff we got during the pandemic if it weren't for them, working their hearts out. But barriers to entry to be a warehouse worker, not quite as much as, say, being a doctor or being a nurse, or even being a certified nursing assistant in the healthcare industry. And it's only one warehouse out of all of them. Amazon's one of the largest, maybe one of the 2 or 3 largest private sector employers in the country. Right, so not enough density, not enough barriers to entry. So the reason that they're not striking is because, although Starbucks did strike one day yesterday, they're back to work today, just to impose a little pain on Starbucks for not bargaining with them, but they're not going to stay out until they get a contract. Why not? Because a strike wouldn't be effective. It wouldn't work. They're not doing it because they're opposed to strikes. Workers United strikes all over the place, but it wouldn't work. Even given the state of the economy and support for unions and increased worker militancy, they just do not have enough power, and that's what this is all about. Strikes are about power. It's unions and workers wielding power because their employers have immense power, not only over them, but in the economy and our politics and beyond. So they're not striking. And my view is that's a really bad thing. Because the fact that you're not, and again, if you've ever been in a romantic relationship or if you're married or have a significant other or whatever it is, this is true also if you have kids. I have this problem with my kids sometimes. The fact that you're not talking about something doesn't mean you don't have a problem. And the fact that people are not striking doesn't mean there aren't horrible problems in those workplaces. And they're not getting solved. Strikes, like it or not, are a means of dispute resolution. That's bare knuckles, I get it, but it's a means of dispute resolution. Not everybody can sit down and reason with one another. Sometimes you got to beat the hell out of each other. And that's what a strike is. It's one side beating up on the other. A lockout is the employer doing the same thing to the union. So let me sum it up and saying, why are there so many strikes? One part of the answer, workers. But the other part of the answer is employers, because it takes 2 to have a strike. I think workers are showing immense courage by wielding the power that they have. Unions have changed leaders, changed objectives, changed strategies, and they are, if you'll excuse the phrase, striking while the iron is hot. But the other part of the answer is that employers are just making strikes necessary and urgent. Some employers are following the Hollywood studios model rather than the UPS model. And that's a story, frankly, that for those who follow the news, you're not hearing very much about. I'll just close with this. I've been invited on, I don't even know how many television shows to talk about this stuff over the course of the last several months. For a while, I was like a regular on Bloomberg television. You don't know that because who watches? I mean, let's be honest. I mean, there's 3 traders on Wall Street who are watching. That's not true. not to my Bloomberg friends, I love you and I really appreciate your having me on. But they have a very particularized audience, and you're not their audience. And frankly, I'm not either. Usually, now my whole family watches Bloomberg now. I've increased that part of their audience. But I was going on a lot of the time. The question was always about, why are unions striking? Always, why are unions striking? And after a while, I started to say, there's another party here. I would often give the answer, because their employers are stupid, because they're making bad decisions, because they miscalculated. I didn't say that about UPS, but I've said many, many times on television, the Hollywood studios bundled this horribly, 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 horribly. And they lost, right? If you're going to screw up, at least win. But they lost. And they lost because they screwed up. They misunderstood the situation. So I really appreciate your patience as I went through that lengthy diatribe and personal stories and reflections. Now I really want to hear from you. Now, Facebook Live audience, we also want to hear from you. We're watching the comments section. So if you have a comment that you would like to make, I'm looking at the camera, I hope. If you have a comment that you'd like to make, just put it in the comments section of the Facebook Live. We have folks here who are watching that, and they will read it to me. But we'll start with folks in the room, but jump in Facebook Live, folks, if you'd like.
And folks in the room, I know that I'm speaking into a microphone and I'm not projecting. That is so that folks online can hear. So if you have a question, I'll come over and give you the mic.
Or comment, or criticism, or confession. Those are welcome as well.
I'll kick it off to break the ice, actually.
Okay, sure.
When I was in college, I studied abroad in France, and this was 2000, turn of the century, and it was somewhat of, we would kind of gently rib our French counterpart students about how often we had seen French people striking.
Right.
And coincidentally, or maybe not so coincidentally, when it was time for me to come back home, it was December, so it was a holiday season, obviously lots of travel, and the pilots were striking. So my flight changed, all of that. And so just knowing that striking was a part of French culture, either officially or unofficially, 20 years ago, I'm wondering what we're seeing internationally, and has it kind of trended higher as we've seen it in the U.S.?
Well, I'm going to politely, lovingly disagree with your characterization that striking is part of
Please
French.
do. We're in an environment of exchange,
Yes,
ideas
absolutely.
exchange.
So I wouldn't say that striking is a part of French culture. It's that Europe's relationship with unions is very, very, very different from the U.S. relationship with unions. We have our culture, our politics, our economy are really quite rabidly anti-union. And we allow employers to do things in the United States that would never, ever be allowed in the Central and Western and Southern European democracies. Never, never, ever. For example, it's legal in the United States to, and I'm going to put quotation marks, Facebook Live, quotation marks on this. You can't fire a striking worker. It's illegal to fire a striking worker. It is legal to permanently replace a striking worker. Okay? I tell you the difference, but who's kidding who? There's not really a meaningful difference between those two things. There is a legal technical difference that labor lawyers like me debate about, like how many angels are dancing on the head of a pin. It's that kind of a debate. But you can permanently replace, but you could never do that in any of the Central, Western, or Southern European democracies. Also, unions have far more power in all of those countries. They are bigger, and they have a system, we have a system in the United States that's called exclusive majority unionism, which means in order to represent a workplace, the union must either win an election or win voluntary recognition from the employer, but only if they have a majority of the workers in that workplace who want the union, right? They've got to say, they either vote for it or they sign what's called an authorization card, and you bring that to the employer, and the employer is allowed to voluntarily recognize you. Then the union in the U.S., you represent everybody in that what's called a bargaining unit. It's really an election unit, but that bargaining unit. So you have to get, if there are 1,000 people in a workplace all in one bargaining unit, you've got to get 501 of them to vote for you. Actually, you've got to get a majority of those who vote, and you never get 100% voting. But let's say everybody votes, you need 501, but then the union doesn't just represent those 501, they represent everybody in the workplace, which is very, very challenging because you're representing a bunch of people who didn't vote for you, many of whom voted and campaigned against you. In Europe, they have a different model, and that is you can have minority unionism, meaning you don't have to have 501, you can have 100 or 200, and you can represent everybody. The employer can do business with you, and you can bargain with the employer. You can represent everybody in that workplace. You can represent only the workers that you have as members. And as a consequence of that, they have much more power, much, much, much more power. The other thing that I would add is, in some of those countries, you have a dual system. You have a union system, and then they have something called works councils, which are law-imposed systems where you have workers involved in solving problems in the workplace, safety and health problems, discrimination. The workers elect the people on the works councils, and then they have to be included by law in decision-making by the employer. Well, that's great for trade unionism because the unions campaign for their members in those works council elections. So I did some business with a company called Volkswagen that you've all heard about. My family makes fun of me because I try to pronounce it in the German Volkswagen. They hate that. But Volkswagen has an immensely powerful works council that and the entire leadership and all of the membership are members of what's called their union, IG Metall. And so the union is sort of represented twice. There's collective bargaining, you have the union, you have the works council, which is the union folks in the works council. And they have immense power by law inside of Volkswagen. So it's a very, very, very different system. So I don't know that the French are culturally more likely to strike, although, you know, they can be a little persnickety. But it's just that this system gives them a lot more power, and so a strike really means something there. Here, we're now in a system, you know, we have a moment in our economic and political history and cultural history where strikes matter a lot, but we've had long, long, long periods from let's say 2001 to 2021 where, you know, striking was the union taking its life in its hands. So. Wait.
No, it's
Wait.
okay. Just use the mic so they can hear you online.
Teachers' strikes are deemed illegal, and unions are fined $50,000 a day.
That's true in Massachusetts.
In Massachusetts. Well,
right.
that's my question. Is that uniquely something Massachusetts does, or is it countrywide? Or?
No, it's not. It's neither. Is the answer. You know, one of the great things about the American system of federalism is different states can do whatever they want. In some regards, particularly with respect to their own employees, and teachers are thought of as being, they're public employees, so they're sort of state employees. They work for the school district, but that's an instrumentality of the state. So in my home state of New York, where I was raised by two public school teachers, it is also illegal for teachers to strike. There's a law called the Taylor Law, where if you strike, you are penalized 2 days of pay for every 1 day of strike, which, you know, my parents were definitely not rich, not as rich as me, for sure. And then let me just say, it's not Northeastern that made me rich. It's not your donations to Northeastern that are making me rich. And so unions almost never struck in New York. Teachers' unions almost never struck. Other public employee unions subject to the same requirement under the Taylor Law. But in other states, you are allowed, public employees, except for cops and firefighters, are allowed to strike. So California allows public employees to strike. So the teachers' union in Los Angeles, for example, had a lengthy strike and they won. Portland, Oregon, right now, has a teacher strike and they won. Now, there's a third category of states that not only don't allow you to strike, they don't allow you to have a union. Now, they can't literally keep you from having a union because there's a little something that some people hop over in order to get to the Second Amendment in the Constitution called the First Amendment to the Constitution, which gives you a right, a freedom of association. So they can't stop you from organizing, they can't stop you from having an organization, but they don't have to bargain with you. And so some states, and you can guess which ones it is, I like to think of it as the Confederacy Plus. They do not have collective bargaining for public employees. And so not only can you not, and therefore you have no right to strike, there's no ability even to strike. And they have different, some of them have something they call meet and confer laws, where they'll sit down with you, but it's not bargaining, and they can listen to you, but they don't have to do what you ask them to do, and you can't enforce it with a strike or any kind of job action. And then there are some that just have nothing at all. And as you heard me say, I think that's an incredibly bad thing. I mean, we can argue about whether cops and firefighters should have the right to strike. I think that's the place where even I'm like, I'm not so sure.
How about nurses?
Well, I think that nurses should be allowed to strike everywhere. You know what? They strike in the private sector, and people do fine. The society doesn't collapse just because nurses went out on strike. They just did, actually, at Kaiser Permanente. And, the employer ended the strike by cutting a deal. Actually, the union ended the strike after 3 days, but they said they were going to strike again if they didn't get a deal, and then they got a deal. The fact that we really need workers should not deprive workers of their right to use their power to get what they need in the workplace. Again, I don't want to say I'm against it for cops and firefighters, but I'm not. I really haven't thought it through enough. It's a very complicated issue with cops and firefighters, and there may be some other first responder types. So, for example, the military, you can't have unions in the military. You can't have unions in the federal sector, in the intelligence agencies. Other national security positions, you can't have unions there. TSA has unions, has a union now, right? Thanks to President Biden. Right? It seems like everything's going just fine to me. So, and I fly a lot. So so the answer to the original question is, it's not nationwide. It varies by state. It's the exceptional case, though, that you can strike if you're a public employee. There are some states that have it, but very few. More are like Massachusetts and New York.
Other questions?
Hi, could you give us a sense of the strength of the negotiating teams in the examples you talked about, UAW and Writers Guild, UPS, and how much of a difference does it really make? And what are the skill differences, and what's the impact of the ultimate, let's call it the CEO levels, and their influence on the negotiators?
Right. That's a fantastic question, and I'm going to qualify my answer with a really big qualifier, which is I was not in the room, and I don't even know a lot of those negotiators. So I really can't speak to their skill level or their experience or anything like that. I can only observe from the outside what it looked like from here. And I think that what you do is more important than what you say. So I was really struck by what folks did and how they behaved. In the automaker context, I think you had highly skilled negotiators on both sides. On the union side, President Fain had just won election weeks before the strike deadline, and he won in a very close election. He was the he was the opposition to the incumbent party inside the union. And so it was a reform slate that won, and they cleaned out a lot of folks, right? So you had a whole bunch of new people, but a lot of the negotiating teams were the same people that had done it before. And so it was my understanding is there was some tension around sort of the relationships inside the union, but they were very, what solved it for them, I think, was there was real clarity around negotiating goals. So the negotiating teams really knew what it was they were trying to accomplish, and I think they had a very clear idea in their minds of where they needed to get, what was the least they could accept, what was the most they wanted to get, and so they had to be somewhere in between. So and I think they showed a lot of skill in that case. In the Writers Guild, and I would say also the actors' strike against the Hollywood studios. Well, let me just say about the Teamsters UPS looked really smooth to me. From the outside, I don't know what was happening in the room, but from the outside it looked like they were really successfully bargaining, which is a sign of real knowledge and skill. They really understood one another. You know, people say, it's like any other thing. There's the public-facing stuff, and then there's the stuff you do in the room. They're not necessarily the same thing. There's a lot of stuff said publicly by both sides, but when they got in the room, they were able to work together and come to a deal with no strike. That's a sign of some level of skill. I'm not saying they're all super duper experts, but they were good. The Writers Guild strike and the Actors strike I thought was very interesting because they were represented by a trade association, AMPTP. The studios were represented by AMPTP. And at some point, when the initial bargaining strategy and its variations was clearly failing, the CEOs jumped in and were at the bargaining table. Iger, the Netflix guy, whose name I can't remember, I apologize. If you're watching, I'm sorry, sir, I can't remember your name. And the others, you know, Discover, which now owns a bunch of properties. And they were at the bargaining table. Now, one of the complications of negotiating as a coalition, which is what that AMPTP was, it was a coalition of all the companies, is you can have dissension in the ranks. You can have disagreements. And there were even some disagreements, I think, in SAG-AFTRA that were coming public. Like, so Clooney went public with some statements and other people went public, and there were letters to Fran Drescher, who was the president of the union, about certain bargaining position things. You know, so there was some, I wouldn't say dissension, but there was certainly some public dialogue, which is not necessarily where you want to be in the middle of a strike. But I think there may have been some disagreement within AMPTP. And you know, when you have a trade association, it's usual, you have to have everybody on board. Everybody has to agree to the position that you're taking. And often, and this is not, I hope this isn't viewed as an insult, it's kind of the lowest common denominator. And that can mean that you're in a really bad bargaining position with the other side. So you're offering them the least, not the most. And the other side's saying, no, 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 we're not going to take that. So I think sometimes you have to pull the bosses to the table and say to them, you guys have to be involved in sorting this out, because I need authority to be able to go further than you've given me authority to go. Now that's one hypothesis. The other hypothesis is the negotiators for AMPTP were just horrible at their jobs and they needed to be replaced by the CEOs. It didn't feel like that to me, but it could have been that. I don't know. Again, that's the problem with not being close enough. But at a minimum, it was that they were not unified, they were not clear, and they had not figured out what Plan B was after Plan A failed horribly. And so sometimes you just need to say to everybody sit down, let's figure it out. We all got to figure it out together because we ain't got a plan, and we need to get a plan. So.
I know we've got to get you on a plane, so I think we probably have time for maybe one more question.
Anybody at home? No questions from out home?
No. Wonderful. Well, Seth, thank you so much. This was really wonderful.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And we have a small token of appreciation for you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Clear so I can take it on the plane.
Exactly. That's the point. Yeah. And thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks a lot.